I am going to tell you something I have never said out loud to anyone. For 3 years, I kept a calendar. Not the kind of calendar you keep to remember appointments, the other kind. The kind you keep to remember things that did not happen. Every time one of my children was supposed to call and did not call, I made a small mark. Every time a visit was promised and then quietly revised into something that never quite materialized, I marked that too. I kept this calendar in the drawer of my bedside table, and I looked at it sometimes in the evenings, and I told myself I was keeping it because the information mattered, because I needed to know what was actually happening rather than what I was telling myself was happening. What I was actually doing was building a case, accumulating evidence for a verdict I had already arrived at, which was that my children did not value me the way I had valued them, did not prioritize me the way I had always prioritized them, and that the distance between what I had given and what I was receiving was a specific and measurable injustice that I deserved to understand fully. I want to tell you where that calendar ended up and what I did instead. But first, I need to tell you who I am and what my life looked like when the calendar started. My name is Anita. I am 84 years old. I was a school counselor for 31 years, which means I spent 3 decades listening to people tell me their versions of their own stories and helping them find the parts of those stories they were not seeing clearly. I was good at it. I had a reputation for it. Students came back years later and told me things I had said to them at 14 that had changed the direction of something important. And those conversations were among the most satisfying experiences of my professional life. And yet, I kept a calendar of my children's failures in the drawer by my bed. The counselor who helped hundreds of young people see their own blind spots could not see hers. My husband Arthur died 6 years ago. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Rebecca is 57 and lives an hour and 40 minutes away. Jonathan is 54 and lives 3 hours north. Catherine is 51 and is the one who lives farthest, nearly 5 hours by car, though she has told me many times that the distance is just distance and not a statement about anything. In the 2 years immediately after Arthur died, the children were present in ways that felt, if not sufficient, at least active. They called regularly. They came for holidays and some weekends. They helped with the things that needed helping with, the house decisions and the financial reorganization and the practical dismantling of a shared life into a single one. They were there in the way that children tend to be there for the acute phase of a parent's loss, before the acute phase ends and life reasserts its claims on everyone. Then the acute phase ended and their lives reasserted. And I, who had been managing the grief with the structure of their attention, suddenly had less structure and more grief, and a growing awareness of the silence between the phone calls. I did what I knew how to do. I kept showing up as a reliable, pleasant, low-demand presence at the end of their phones. I called on Sundays with Rebecca and Wednesdays with Jonathan and every other Friday with Catherine, a schedule I had established in the first year and maintained with a consistency that I thought demonstrated love and that I now understand demonstrated something more complicated than love. I asked about their lives. I asked about the grandchildren. I kept track of what was happening, and I followed up with genuine interest. And I ended every call by saying, I love you, and that I would talk to them soon. And I meant all of it, every word, and none of it changed the fact that the visits were rare and growing rarer. The calendar started in the 3rd year. I do not remember the specific day I began it. I remember the feeling that prompted it, which was the feeling of a woman who had been told something repeatedly and who did not fully believe it, and who had decided to make it measurable rather than just felt. The something I was being told by the pattern of their absences was that I was not a priority. The calendar was my attempt to prove that this was objectively true rather than merely my perception. It was a miserable project. I want to say that clearly. There is nothing in the activity of cataloging the ways the people you love fall short of your expectations that produces anything except more cataloging. The calendar did not make me feel justified. It made me feel small and watchful and perpetually disappointed and entirely focused on the dimension of my children's behavior that confirmed the story I was telling myself rather than the full, complicated human truth of who they were and what they were managing and what they were and were not capable of giving. I was a school counselor for 31 years. I knew this about calendars of grievance within the first month of keeping mine. I kept keeping it for 3 years anyway, which tells you something about the difference between knowing a thing and being ready to do something with what you know. What finally ended the calendar was not an insight. It was a conversation with my friend Vera. Vera is 79 years old. She has been my closest friend since we were both young teachers at the same school in our 30s. And she has the particular quality of honesty that comes from a friendship long enough and solid enough that the truth can be said without it threatening the structure. She came to stay for a weekend in the autumn of the third calendar year, and on the second evening we were sitting with wine in the living room, and she asked me how things were with the children, and I told her. Not with self-pity, I thought, with data. I had data. Vera listened to all of it. Then she said something that I have turned over every day since. She said, Anita, you spent 30 years teaching children that the story they told about themselves was not the only story available. What story are you telling about yourself right now? I did not answer. I did not have an answer that would hold up. She said, You are telling the story of a woman who is owed something and not receiving it. And that is a true story in some ways, but it is not the only true story. And it is the story that is making you the least visible version of yourself. And invisible people do not get visited. Invisible. I sat with that word for a long time after she went to bed. What Vera had identified with the precision of someone who had known me for nearly 50 years was the mechanism I had been operating from without seeing it. I had made myself into a consistent, pleasant, low-demand presence because I did not want to be a burden. I had made myself small and manageable and reliably available because I thought that was the considerate thing to be. And in doing so, I had made myself, as she said, invisible. Not invisible in the sense of absent, invisible in the sense of not requiring attention, not commanding it, not being the kind of presence in my children's lives that created a felt pull toward me. I have been so careful to make things easy for them that I had made myself irrelevant to the fabric of their actual days. The calendar went in the bin the morning after Vera's visit. What I did instead is the thing I want to tell you about, and I want to be honest that it felt strange and uncomfortable, and that I was not entirely sure in the beginning that it was not a form of manipulation. I have thought about that question carefully, and I have arrived at an answer I am at peace with, which is that what I did was not manipulation, it was honesty. The two things can look similar from the outside, but they feel entirely different from the inside, and the inside is where the difference lives. I stopped calling on schedule. Not completely, not as a withdrawal or a punishment or a performance of wounded absence, but the Sunday Rebecca call, and the Wednesday Jonathan call, and the every other Friday Catherine call, that structure which I had built and maintained for years as a kind of scaffolding that held the relationship in place by my own effort, I let it go. The first week felt wrong. The second week felt like I was doing something to them, which was not what I wanted. And I almost picked the schedule back up just to make the feeling stop. The third week, something else started to emerge, which was the quiet surprise of not being the one always waiting by the phone for the conversation to happen, of not being the consistent initiator who was also perpetually hoping that the initiation would be met with more than it was being met with. They called, not immediately, not all three of them, not in the pattern I would have designed, but they called. Rebecca called on a Tuesday, which she had never done, and the call had a different quality to it, slightly less routine, slightly more real, as though the call had been prompted by something rather than by the calendar. Jonathan called on a Thursday and asked if I was all right, and I said I was very well. And there was something in that exchange that was more present than the Wednesday calls had been for years. Catherine called twice in the same week, which she had not done in longer than I could easily remember. I did not explain the change. I did not draw attention to it. I simply received the calls as though they were ordinary, which they were, and which was the point. But the calls were only part of it, and not the most important part. The most important part was what I did with the space that had opened up where the calling schedule had been. I started painting again. I had painted seriously in my 20s and had let it go entirely by my 30s, when the children and the career had absorbed everything available. I set up a corner of the spare bedroom with the materials, and I began again, with the complete clumsiness of someone returning to something after 5 decades away. The first things I made were not good. I kept making them. After 6 weeks, they became better. After 3 months, they became occasionally surprising, which is what I have always believed real making requires, the capacity to surprise yourself with what emerges. I joined a group at my community center, 3 women and 1 man, all around my age, who met on Thursday mornings to work on whatever they were individually working on in the same room. I did not go to this group looking for anything except the company of people making things. What I found was a community of people who were interested in each other's work with a particular pointed interest of practitioners, not the polite interest of spectators. Within 2 months, I knew these people better than I had known most of the neighbors I had lived near for a decade. I started writing, not a journal, which I had kept sporadically for years and which had become a record of grievances, not unlike the calendar, something different. I started writing down stories from my years of counseling, anonymized and altered, but true in the ways that mattered. The patterns I had seen and the things I had learned, and the moments when something changed for a young person in ways I could see but they could not yet name. I did not know who these pieces were for. I wrote them because they needed writing and because writing them was a way of staying in relationship with the work that had defined 40 years of my life. Catherine read one of the pieces when she visited in the spring. She had come for a long weekend, the longest visit she had made in several years, and she found the folder on the kitchen table And I said she could read it if she wanted to. And she sat with it for 20 minutes and then looked at me across the table with an expression I did not immediately know how to read. She said, "Mom, I didn't know you had been holding all of this." I said, "There is a great deal I hold that does not come through in Sunday calls." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I have been calling you instead of seeing you. Like the call was the same thing as being here. But it isn't, is it?" I said, "No, it really isn't." That visit, she stayed 3 days. We cooked together and walked in the mornings, and she sat with me in the painting corner and asked about what I was working on with the genuine curiosity of someone seeing a part of her mother she had not known was there. On the last morning, she said she wanted to come back in 2 months, and I said I would look forward to it. She came back in 2 months. She has come back every 2 to 3 months since. Rebecca started coming more often when she understood, through the change in the texture of our conversations, that there was more to visit than the person she had been visiting before. Jonathan is still the least frequent, which has to do with his own life and his own patterns, and which I have accepted without a calendar. He comes when he comes. When he comes, he is present in a way that matters. I have learned to measure by quality rather than by frequency, which is a better measurement and one that took me embarrassingly long to arrive at. I want to tell you what I think actually happened, because I have had enough time now to see it clearly. The calling schedule was not connection. It was the maintenance of connection's appearance. It was the form without the substance. It kept the relationship technically active while actually demonstrating week after week that I was willing to do all the initiating work and that no particular quality of presence was required from the other side. It trained my children, unintentionally and over years, to receive my contact as ambient rather than as something that required their full attention and genuine response. When I stopped filling the space with my own consistent effort, the space became something they had to choose whether to fill. And when they filled it by their own choosing, something different came through. The call that Rebecca made on a Tuesday because she had been thinking about me and wanted to talk had a completely different quality from the call that would have happened on Sunday because it was Sunday and that was when we called. One was a reflex, the other was a reach. I needed to make myself the kind of presence they reached for rather than the kind they reflexively maintained. The painting and the writing and the Thursday group were not strategies to make myself more interesting to my children. They were the actual life I should have been living all along, and the calendar had been both a symptom and a cause of my not living it. I had been so focused on measuring what my children were not giving me that I had not been giving anything to myself. And a person who is not giving anything to herself becomes, over time, a person without much to offer to anyone else either. Not because she is depleted exactly, but because she has forgotten the practice of her own richness. When I found that practice again, when the painting corner existed and the writing folder was filling, and Thursday mornings had their own pool and my days had a center that was mine, rather than organized around waiting, I became again the person my children had known when they were growing up. The person who was making things and thinking about things and had something specific and alive in her when you walk into the room. Not the careful, pleasant, low demand version, the actual one. The actual one is more interesting to visit. I burned the calendar, literally. I took it outside on a cold November morning and put it in the old metal bin Leonard used to use for yard waste. And I lit a match, and I watched 3 years of small marks turn to ash. It took about 40 seconds. I stood there for a while after it was done, in the cold, watching the smoke, feeling something I eventually identify as embarrassed relief. Embarrassed that I had kept it, relief that I was done. Then I went inside and made tea and sat in the painting corner and worked on the thing I had been working on all week and did not think about Sunday or Wednesday or every other Friday for the rest of the day. That was the beginning of the life I am living now, not the calendar life. This one. You deserve this one too. Whatever version of the calendar you have been keeping in a drawer or in your head or in the particular quality of attention you bring to each phone call that falls short of what you were hoping for, put it down. Not because your children do not owe you more presents. They probably do. Not because the absence does not hurt. It does. But because the calendar is keeping you from the person you need to become in order to be someone they want to come back to. Become her. She's still there. She has been waiting in the painting corner, in the writing folder, in the Thursday morning group, in whatever the equivalent is for you. Go find her. Bring her back. Your children will follow. There is one more thing I want to say, because I think it is the piece that people most easily misread in what I have described. The change I made was not about making myself less available in order to make my children anxious. That would have been manipulation, and it would have deserved the name. What I did was something that sounds similar from the outside, but is different at its foundation. I stopped performing availability I did not actually feel in order to protect a relationship I was actually damaging with the performance. The Sunday calls, the Wednesday calls, the every other Friday calls, I had built that structure in the belief that consistency was love. That showing up reliably at the designated time was the way you demonstrated commitment. And in the first years after Arthur died, when I genuinely needed the structure and they genuinely needed to provide it, that was true. The structure held something real while the real thing was finding its footing. But I had maintained the structure long past the point when it was serving anything except the appearance of closeness. What I was calling every Sunday was not connection. It was the habit of connection. And habits, whatever their origin, do not require genuine presence. They run on momentum. They can be performed in parallel with thinking about something else, with half the attention, with a specific quality of mind that processes routine without fully arriving. I had been calling into that quality of attention for years without naming it to myself. The calendar was my way of naming it obliquely, of registering the disappointment without looking directly at what was disappointing me. What was disappointing me was not that my children did not love me. It was that I had built an arrangement that did not require their love in any active sense, only their habit. And habit is a very thin thing to subsist on. Vera was right that I had made myself invisible. But I want to add something to what she said, because I think the full picture is more useful than the partial one. I had not only made myself invisible, I had made myself a fixture, and fixtures do not require a decision. You do not decide to use the light switch in the hallway. You use it because it is there, and because it is always there, and because the question of whether you want to reach for it never arises. I had turned myself into a light switch. And light switches do not get visited, they get switched. When I stopped being a fixture, I became a presence again. A presence is something you choose, something you decide to go toward, something whose absence you notice in a different way than you notice that the hallway is dark. That is what the painting and the writing gave me ultimately. Not a more interesting version of myself to present to my children on their visits, though that was a consequence. A way of being present in my own life that made presence itself the quality I brought to things, including to the calls I still made and received, and including to the visits when they happened. I was not available in the routine way anymore. I was present in the real way. And real presence draws people toward it in a way that routine availability never quite does. My youngest grandchild asked me once what I did all day. She was 12. She was genuinely curious in the way that 12-year-olds are when they suddenly realize that all people might have interior lives. I told her I painted in the mornings and wrote in the afternoons, and on Thursdays I went to my group, and that I was reading 3 books at the same time, which she found strange but interesting. She said, "You sound busy." I said, "I am, wonderfully." She came to stay for a week last summer. She sat with me in the painting corner every morning and worked on her own things and asked questions that reminded me why I became a teacher and why I have never stopped being one in the ways that matter. On the last day, she said, "Grandma, can I come back at Christmas?" I said, "I will make room." She came back at Christmas. She brought a friend. That is the life I am living, not the calendar life, not the waiting life, not the low-demand, carefully maintained, perpetually disappointed life of a woman who had decided, without meaning to, that her own richness was something to be apologized for rather than offered. This life, specific, full, mine. Your version of it is waiting for you, not in the drawer with the calendar, in the thing you stopped doing when the grief and the managing and the careful smallness of trying not to be a burden took everything else, in the person you put aside to become the person you thought would be easier for everyone to have around. She is not easier, she is better. And better is what your children actually need when they walk through your door. Be her. Everything else follows from that.